Io was not the only girl, I presume they mean young woman, who gained geographical fame because Zeus fell in love with her. There was another, known far more widely, Europa, the daughter of the king of Sidon. But, whereas the wretched had to pay dearly for the distinction, Europa was exceedingly fortunate, except for a few moments of terror when she found herself crossing the deep sea on the back of a bull. She did not suffer at all. The story does not say what Hera was about at the time, but it is clear that she was off guard and her husband free to do as he pleased. Up in heaven, one spring morning, he idly watched the earth. Zeus suddenly saw a charming spectacle. Europa waked early, troubled as Io had been by a dream, only this time not of an entity who loved her, but of two continents, who each, in the shape of a woman, tried to possess her. Asia sang she had given her birth, and therefore owned her, and the other, as yet nameless, declaring that Zeus would give the maiden to her. Once awake from this strange vision which had come at dawn, the time when true dreams oftenest visit mortals, the last third of the night between dusk and dawn, are, well, also the dawn, also the twilights are important times too. I'm not sure exactly what they mean, but Europa decided not to try to go to sleep again, but to summon her companions, girls born in the same year as herself, and all of noble birth, to go out with her to the lovely blooming meadows near the sea. Here was their favorite meeting place, whether they wanted to dance or bathe their fur bodies at the river mouth or gang flowers. This time, all had brought baskets, knowing that the flowers were now at the perfection. Europa's was of gold, exquisitely chased with figures, which showed, oddly enough, the story of Io, her journeys in the shape of a cow, the death of Argus, and Zeus lightly touching her with his divine hand and changing her back into a woman. It was, as may be perceived, a marvel worth gazing upon, and had been made by no less a personage than Hephaestus, the celestial workman of Olympus. Lovely as the basket was, there were flowers as lovely to fill it with. Sweet-smelling narcissus, and hyacinths, and violets, and yellow crocus, and most radiant of all, the crimson splendor of the wild rose. The girls gathered them delightedly, wandering here and there over the meadows, each one a maiden fairest among the fair. Even so Europa shone out among them, as an entity of love outshines the sister graces. It was that very entity of love who brought about what next happened. As Zeus in heaven watched the pretty scene, she who alone can conquer Zeus, along with her son, the mischievous boy Cupid, shot one of her shafts into his heart, and at that very instant he fell madly in love with Europa. Even though Hera was away, he thought it well to be cautious, and before appearing to Europa, he changed himself into a bull, not such a one as you might see in a stall or grazing in a field, but one beautiful beyond all bulls that ever were, bright chestnut in color, with a silver circle on his brow and horns like the crescent of the young moon. He seemed so gentle as well as so lovely with the girls, were not frightened at his coming, but gathered around to caress him and to breathe the heavenly fragrance that came from him. Sweeter even than of the flowery meadow, it was Europa he drew toward, and, as she gently touched him, he lowed so musically no flute could give forth a more melodious sound. Then he lay down before her feet, and seemed to show her his broad back, and she cried to the others to come with her and mount him, for surely he will bear us on his back. He is so mild and dear and gentle to behold. He is not like a bull, but like a good, true man, except he cannot speak. The Beauty riding the Beast story, a lot of this surely has got to connect to this in some way or another. Smiling, she sat down on his back, but the others, quick though they were to follow her, had no chance. The bull leaped up and at full speed rushed to the seashore, and then not into but over the wide water, and as he went, waves grew smooth before him, and a whole procession rose up from the deep and accompanied him. The strange sea entities, Nereids, riding upon dolphins, and Tritons, blowing their horns, and the mighty master of the sea himself, Zeus's own brother. Europa, frightened equally by the wondrous creature she saw and the moving waters all around, clung with one hand to the bull's great horn, and with the other caught up her purple dress to keep it dry, and the winds swelled out the deep folds even as a snail swells on a ship, and ever gently thus they wafted her. No bull could this be, thought Europa, but most certainly an entity, and she spoke pleadingly to him, begging him to pity her and not leave her in some strange place all alone. He spoke to her in answer and showed her that she had guessed rightly what he was. She had no cause to fear, he told her. He was Zeus, the greatest of the gods, and all he was doing was from love of her. He was taking her to Crete, his own island, where his mother had hidden him from Cronos when he was born, and there she would bear him glorious sons, whose scepters shall hold sway over all men on earth. I don't know, is there any sign that he actually fell in love with her, or is just feeling lust here? Everything happened, of course, as Zeus had said. Crete came into sight. They landed, and the seasons, the gatekeepers of Olympus, arrayed her for her bridal. Her sons were famous men, not only in this world, but in the next, where two of them, Minos and Rhadamanthus, were rewarded for their justice upon the earth by being made the judges of the dead, but her own name remains the best known of all. Well, I guess we can leave off the rape part. Enlil in the Sumerian mythology also is said to have pulled off some of that stuff, right? And no, that's... Well, for some people, it's like, well, for some rapists, they actually are in love with their victim, who's going to make love to them whether they want to or not. But, males and females who commit that crime. But there's a difference between, just wanting people physically and being in love with them. The Cyclops, Polythemus. The first part of this story goes back to the Odyssey. The second part is told only by a 3rd century Alexandrian poet, Theocritus. The last part could have been written by no other except the satirist Lucian in the 2nd century of the Common Era, at least 1,000 years separate from the beginning from the end. Homer's vigor and power of storytelling, the pretty fancies of Theocritus, the smart cynicism of Lucian, illustrate in their degree the course of Greek literature. And the Bible actually illustrates some of that there's even greater differences of time when one part was written versus another of even the same book, and how those are reworkings of sometimes almost unimaginably, well, I mean, in some people's imaginations anyways, older things, like adding a zero to the number of years ago that such things were written. But to the end. All the monstrous forms of life which were first created, the 100-handed creatures, the giants and so on, were permanently banished from the earth when they had been conquered. With the single exception of the Cyclops, they were allowed to come back, and they became finally great favorites of Zeus. They were wonderful workmen, and they forged his thunderbolts. At first, there had been only 3, but later there were many. Zeus gave them a home in a fortunate country, where the vineyards and cornlands, unplowed and unsown, bore fruits plenteously. They had great flocks of sheep and goats as well, and they lived at their ease. Their fierceness and savage temper, however, did not grow less. They had no lawns or courts of justice, but each one did as he pleased. It was not a good country for strangers. Well, so the pursuit of happiness goes awry, right? Ages after Prometheus was punished, when the descendants of the men he helped had grown civilized and had learned to build far-sailing ships, a Greek prince beached his boat on the shore of this dangerous land. His name was Odysseus, Ulysses in Latin, and he was on his way home after the destruction of Troy. In the hardest battle he had fought with the Trojans. He had never come as near to death as he did then. Not far from the spot where his crew had made the vessel fast was a cave, open toward the sea and very lofty. It looked inhabited. There was a strong fence before the entrance. Odysseus started off to explore it with 12 of his men. They were in need of food and took with him a goatskin full of very potent and mellow wine to give whoever lived there in return for hospitality. The gate in the fence was not closed, and they made their way into the cave. No one was there, but it was clearly the dwelling of some prosperous person. Along the sides of the cave were many crowded pens of lambs and kids. Also, there were racks full of cheeses and pails brimming with milk, delightful to the sea-worn travelers, who ate and drank as they waited for the master. At last he came, hideous and huge, tall as a great mountain crag. Driving his flock before him, he entered and closed the cave's mouth with a ponderous slab of stone. Then, looking around, he caught sight of the strangers and cried out in a dreadful booming voice, "Who are you who enter unbidden the house of Polythemus? Traitors are thieving pirates. They were terror-stricken at the sight and sound of him, but Odysseus made swift to answer and firmly too. Shipwrecked warriors from Troy are we, and your suppliants under the protection of Zeus." The suppliants entity. But Polythemus roared out that he cared not for Zeus. He was bigger than any entity and feared none of them. With that he stretched out his mighty arms, and in each great hand he seized one of the men and dashed his brains out on the ground. Slowly he feasted off them to the last shred, and then, satisfied, stretched himself out across the cavern and slept. He was safe from attack. No one but he could roll back the huge stone before the door, and if the horrified men had been able to summon courage and strength enough to kill him, they would have been imprisoned there forever. During that long, terrible night, Odysseus faced the awful thing that had happened, and would happen to every one of them if he could not think out some way of escape. But by the time day had dawned, and the flock, gathering at the entrance, woke the Cyclops up, no idea at all had come to him. He had to watch 2 more of his company die, for Polythemus breakfasted as he had supped. He breakfasted as he had supped. Then he drove out his flock, moving back the big block at the door and pushing it into place again as easily as a man opens and shuts the lid to his quiver. Throughout the day, shut in the cave, Odysseus thought and thought. 4 of his men had perished hideously. Must they all go the same dreadful way? At last a plan shaped itself in his mind. An enormous timber lay near the pens, as long and as thick as the mast of a 20-oared ship. From this he cut off a good piece, and then he and his men sharpened it, and hardened the point by turning it round and round in the fire. And they had finished and hidden it by the time the Cyclops came back. There followed the same horrible feast as before. When it was over, Odysseus filled a cup with his own wine that he had brought with him, and offered it to the Cyclops. He emptied it with delight and demanded more, and Odysseus poured for him until finally a drunken sleep overcame him. Then Odysseus and his men drew out the great stake from its hiding place and heated the point in the fire until it almost burst into flame. Some power from on high breathed a mad courage into them, and they drove the red-hot spike right into the Cyclops' eye. With an awful scream, he sprang up and wrenched the point out. This way and that he flung around the cavern, searching for his tormentors. But blind as he was, they were able to slip away from him. At last, he pushed aside the stone at the entrance and sat down there, stretching his arms across, thinking thus to catch them when they tried to get away. But Odysseus had made a plan for this too. He bade each man choose out 3 thick fleeced rams and bind them together with strong pliant strips of bark, then to wait for day, when the flock would be sent out to pasture. At last the dawn came, and, as the beast crowding through the entrance passed out, the Polyphemus fell over them to be sure that no one carried a man on his back. He never thought to feel underneath, but that was where the men were, each tucked under the middle ram, holding on to the great fleece. Once out of that fearful place, they dropped to the ground and, hurrying to the ship, in no time launched it and were aboard. But Odysseus was too angry to leave in prudent silence. He sent a great shout over the water to the blind giant at the cave's mouth. So, Cyclops, you were not quite strong enough to eat all of the puny men. You are rightly punished for what you did to those who were guests in your house. The words stung Polyphemus to the heart. Up he sprung and tore a great crag from the mountain and flung it at the ship, and came within a hair's breadth of crushing the prow. And with the backwash the boat was borne landward. The crew put all their strength into their oars, and just succeeded in pulling out to sea. When Odysseus saw that they were safely away, he cried again tauntingly, "Cyclops, Odysseus, wrecker of cities, put out your eye, and do you so tell anyone who asks." But they were too far out by then. The giant could do nothing. He sat blindly on the shore. This was the only story told about Polyphemus. For many years, centuries passed, and he was still the same. A frightful monster, shapeless, huge, his eye put out, but finally he changed, as what is ugly and evil is apt to change and grow milder with time. Perhaps some storyteller saw the helpless, suffering creature Odysseus left behind as a thing to be pitied. At all events, the next story about him shows him in a very pleasing light, not terrifying at all, but a most poor creature, a most poor, credulous monster, a most ridiculous monster, quite aware of how hideous and uncouth and repulsive he was, and therefore wretched, because he was madly in love with the charming, mocking sea nymph, Galatea. Oh, is that who the Galatians were named after? Or that place? But by this time, the place where he lived was Sicily, and he had somehow got his eye back, perhaps by some miracle of his father, who in this story is Poseidon, the great entity of the sea. The lovelorn giant knew Galatea would never have him. His case was hopeless, and yet, whenever his pain made him harden his heart against her, and bid himself, "Milk the ewe you have, why pursue what shuns you?" the minx would come softly stealing near him, then suddenly a shower of apples would pelt his flock, and her voice would ring in his ears, calling him a laggard in love. But no sooner was he up and after her than she would be off, laughing at his slow clumsiness as he tried to follow her. All he could do was again to sit wretched and helpless on the shore, but this time not trying in fury to kill people, only singing mournful love songs to soften the sea nymph's heart. In a much later story, Galatea turned kind, not because the exquisite, delicate, milk-white maid, as Polyphemus called her in his songs, fell in love with the hideous one-eyed creature. In this tale, too, he has got back his eye, but became, she prudently reflected, that he was the favored son of the Lord of the Sea, and by no means to be despised. Well, liege lord of the sea could be. So he told her sister nymph, maybe not even in the physical sense, but in a, So he told her sister nymph, Doris, who had rather hoped to attract the Cyclops herself, and who began the talk by saying scornfully, "A fine lover you've got, that Sicilian shepherd. Everybody's talking about it." Galatea said, "None of your airs, please. He's the son of Poseidon." "There," Doris said. "Zeus. For all I care, one thing's certain. He's an ugly, ill-mannered brute." Galatea said, "Just let me tell you, Doris, there's something very manly about him. Of course it's true he's got only one eye, but he sees as well with it as if he had two." Doris said, "It sounds as if you were in love yourself." Galatea said, "I in love with Polyphemus? Not I. But of course I can guess why you're talking like this. You know perfectly well he has never noticed you, only me." Doris said, "A shepherd with only one eye thinks you handsome. That's something to be proud of." Anyway, you won't have to cook for him. He can make a very good meal off a traveler, I understand. But Polyphemus never won Galatia. She fell in love with a beautiful young prince named Achis, whom Polyphemus, fiercely jealous, killed. However, Achis was changed into a river entity, so that his story ended well. But we are not told that Polyphemus ever loved any maiden except Galatia, or that any maiden ever loved Polyphemus. Flower myths: Narcissus, Hyacinth, Adonis. The first story about the creation of the Narcissus is told only in an early Homeric hymn of the 7th or 8th century. The second I have taken from Ovid. There is an immense difference between the two poets, who are separated from each other not only by 600 or 700 years, but also by fundamental differences between the Greek and the Roman. The hymn is written objectively, simply without a touch of affection. The poet is thinking of his subject. Ovid is, as always, thinking about his audience, but he tells us this story very well. The bit about the ghost trying to look at itself in the river of death is a subtle touch which is quite characteristic of him, and quite unlike any Greek writer. Euripides gives the best account of the festival of Hyacinthus. Apollodorus and Ovid both tell his story. Whenever there is any vividness in my narrative, it may be ascribed securely to Ovid. Apollodorus never deviates into anything like that. Adonis I have taken from 2 3rd century poets, Theocritus and Bion. The tale is typical of the Alexandrian poets, tender, a little soft, but always in exquisite taste. In Greece, there are most lovely wild flowers. They would be beautiful anywhere, but Greece is not a rich and fertile country of wide meadows and fruitful fields where flowers seem at home. It is a land of rocky ways and stony hills and rugged mountains, and in such places the exquisite, vivid bloom of the wild flowers, a profusion of delight, joyous, bewilderingly bright, comes as a startling surprise. Bleak heights are carpeted in radiant colors. Every crack and crevice of a frowning crag blossoms. The contrast of this laughing, luxuriant beauty with the clear-cut, austere grandeur all around arrest of the attention sharply. Elsewhere, wild flowers may be little noticed, but never in Greece. Well, it depends on who you're speaking